The ranch never felt like something I owned, not in the way people usually mean ownership. Because from the first morning I stood at the edge of the property 11 years ago, watching fog lift off the low fields and roll back toward the tree line, it was clear the land recognized me long before I recognized what it would become. It had been my grandfather's long before it was mine, shaped by his patience rather than machinery, marked by fence posts he set by hand and trails worn down by decades of slow, deliberate movement. When he passed, the inheritance came with paperwork and condolences, but what stayed with me was the silence that followed, the kind of quiet that settles into your chest and forces you to listen. I moved onto the ranch not as a plan but as a necessity, needing distance from a world that felt louder and more entitled by the year. And for a long time, the land gave me exactly what I asked for. The ranch sat just far enough from the edge of a growing suburb to feel isolated, yet close enough that the creeping lines of development were always visible if you looked too hard. For years, those lines stayed where they were, and I believed the unspoken rule still held true. Older land carried older authority. I lived simply, not because I had to, but because the place demanded it, waking early, maintaining the fences, repairing structures instead of replacing them, and letting the land dictate my pace rather than the other way around. The value of the property increased quietly, almost politely, driven by forces I never invited, numbers rising on paper while life on the ground remained unchanged. $9 million became a phrase people liked to say later, but back then it was just acreage, water rights, and a view that never got old. The HOA arrived gradually, not as a confrontation but as an assumption, appearing first as flyers in nearby mailboxes, then as decorative entrance signs at the edge of newly built streets, and finally as meetings advertised with language that suggested unity while quietly enforcing conformity. I was never part of it, never opted in, never attended, and for a long time that absence went unnoticed. The ranch predated the HOA, its boundaries legally recorded and physically reinforced long before community standards were printed on glossy paper, and that fact alone seemed to protect me. Years passed without incident, and the peace felt earned, like a reward for respecting something older than myself. Then subtle changes began to appear, not on my land, but around it, the kind you notice only after they've already settled in. The traffic increased on the access road that ran near the southern fence, unfamiliar vehicles slowing down as they passed, people leaning forward in their seats to stare a little too long. The soundscape shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed weekends were louder, evenings filled with distant music and laughter drifting in from developments that hadn't existed when I first moved in. Still, nothing crossed the line, and I held on to the belief that proximity didn't automatically mean interference. That belief cracked the first time a patrol car appeared at the gate. Lights off, engine idling, an unfamiliar presence framed by a place that had never required permission to exist. The report was vague, something about noise, something about a complaint, and although it went nowhere, it planted a seed of awareness I hadn't needed before. From that moment on, the ranch felt watched, not by the land, which had always been observant, but by people who saw it as a problem waiting to be solved. The HOA president's name surfaced slowly, attached to emails forwarded by neighbors I barely knew, her tone polished and confident, her authority assumed rather than earned. Margaret Peterson had a reputation for order, for community pride, for ensuring property values remained strong, and at first glance, that reputation seemed harmless. What I didn't realize then was that her definition of order had no room for land that refused to be reshaped, no patience for boundaries she couldn't redraw, and no respect for a legacy she hadn't approved. The early complaints felt almost laughable, citing issues that didn't apply, referencing rules that didn't govern me, but the repetition turned them into something else entirely, a pattern rather than an accident. Each call, each notice, each visit from authorities chipped away at the illusion that longevity alone could protect what was mine. I started documenting everything, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the same instinct my grandfather had when he taught me that land disputes never start loud, they start polite. The ranch itself didn't change. The mornings still came with the same light, the fences still stood, and the animals moved through familiar paths, but my relationship with the place shifted, evolving from caretaker to guardian. Somewhere along the way, I realized the peace I thought was permanent had only been tolerated, and tolerance, once tested, rarely survives ambition. The value of the land continued to rise, whispered about in real estate circles, discussed in HOA meetings I never attended, and calculated by people who saw numbers where I saw memory. What none of them understood yet was that the ranch wasn't just an asset waiting to be absorbed. It was a line drawn decades ago, reinforced by law, labor, and a refusal to bend. As the first official warning arrived in the mail, stamped and formal, carrying language designed to intimidate rather than inform, I understood that the quiet chapter of my life was ending, replaced by something more deliberate, more confrontational, and far less forgiving. The land remembered my name, but now others were learning it too, and not all of them intended to respect it. The stage had been set, the first moves already made, and as the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, casting long shadows across a ranch that had outlasted every attempt to control it so far, the coming fight felt inevitable, like a storm you smell in the air before the sky ever darkens, waiting just beyond the horizon for the moment it's finally unleashed. The second chapter of the conflict did not announce itself with drama or confrontation, but with paperwork, repetition, and the slow realization that someone somewhere had decided my existence was inconvenient. Because once the first official warning arrived, it was followed by another, and then another, each one slightly different in wording but identical in intent, creating a rhythm designed to exhaust rather than resolve. What unsettled me most was not the content of the notices themselves, which cited noise levels that didn't exist, unauthorized structures that had stood longer than the surrounding subdivision, and land use violations pulled from a rulebook I was never bound to, but the confidence with which they were delivered, as if truth had become optional when authority felt justified. The HOA had found a method, and that method relied on pressure rather than proof, counting on the assumption that most people would comply simply to make the problem go away. I didn't comply, not out of stubbornness, but because compliance would have implied legitimacy, and that was something I couldn't afford to concede. The ranch had boundaries recorded in county offices older than the HOA itself, exemptions embedded in zoning maps that predated their community standards, and yet every response I sent was met with silence or deflection, as though facts were an inconvenience rather than a foundation. The police visits became more frequent, each one polite, each one professional, but each one carrying the same undertone of suspicion, as if repetition alone could transform a false claim into a credible concern. I watched the pattern form with unsettling clarity, understanding that the goal wasn't enforcement but intimidation, a steady erosion of peace meant to make daily life uncomfortable enough that leaving would feel like relief. Neighbors who once waved now looked away, not out of hostility, but caution, because involvement carried risk, and risk was something the HOA had successfully reframed as disorder. Margaret Peterson's influence became impossible to ignore, her name appearing on correspondence, her presence felt even when she wasn't physically there, shaping perception through language that framed me not as a landowner, but as a problem adjacent to progress. The narrative was subtle but effective, painting the ranch as an eyesore, a source of disruption, a holdout preventing the neighborhood from reaching its full potential, and once that story took hold, reality became secondary. I found myself scrutinized not just by officials, but by residents who had never spoken to me, their curiosity sharpened into judgment by carefully worded emails and meetings held behind closed doors. The ranch, which had always existed quietly alongside growth, was now portrayed as a threat to harmony, and that shift marked the first true line crossed. It was no longer about compliance, it was about control, about reshaping the environment to fit a vision that valued uniformity over history. Financial pressure followed swiftly, fines threatened without basis, legal language deployed to create urgency where none legally existed, and the implication that continued resistance would result in consequences vague enough to be frightening. I consulted attorneys, not because I doubted my position, but because I understood the danger of underestimating a system that thrived on attrition, and every consultation confirmed the same truth. I was in the right, but being right didn't guarantee peace. The HOA's strategy relied on persistence, on the hope that time, stress, and social isolation would do what legality could not. I began documenting more meticulously, recording dates, times, visits, correspondence, and inconsistencies, building a record not just for defense, but for clarity, because gaslighting thrives in the absence of evidence. The more I documented, the clearer the pattern became, revealing coordination where coincidence had once been plausible. Complaints spiked before HOA meetings, police visits followed internal votes, and notices referenced discussions I was never invited to, exposing a closed loop of decision-making that excluded the one person most affected. The realization shifted something fundamental in me, transforming frustration into resolve, because the ranch was no longer just land under threat. It was a test case for whether power could rewrite reality through persistence alone. I adjusted my routines not out of fear but awareness, cameras installed not to surveil others, but to protect myself, logs kept not because I expected immediate justice, but because I understood how narratives collapse under scrutiny when patience outlasts pressure. The HOA escalated in response, interpreting preparedness as defiance and defiance as provocation, tightening their grip in ways that only confirmed their intentions. Community events I had never attended suddenly included discussions about rural compatibility, about noise standards, about aesthetic cohesion, language crafted to sound inclusive while drawing a clear boundary around who belonged. I belonged to the land, but not to their vision, and that distinction mattered more to them than any legal document. What surprised me most was how quickly peace became conditional, how years of quiet coexistence meant nothing once value entered the conversation. Because $9 million wasn't just a number, it was motivation, a justification for inconvenience, and eventually, displacement. The ranch's worth had transformed it from overlooked to coveted, and with that transformation came entitlement disguised as stewardship. I could feel the pressure mounting not in dramatic gestures, but in the accumulation of small disruptions designed to wear me down, to make every day slightly harder than the last. And yet, beneath that pressure, something steadier formed, a clarity rooted in the understanding that retreat would validate a process that thrived on exploitation. This wasn't about noise or fences or compliance. It was about whether a legacy could be erased by bureaucracy wielded with enough confidence. As the chapter closed, with another notice arriving just before sunset, stamped and formal, echoing claims already disproven, I understood that the line had not only been crossed, it had been intentionally trampled, and the path forward would require more than patience. The ranch had survived decades of change because it adapted without surrendering its core, and now, faced with a challenge that sought not to coexist, but to consume, I prepared to respond with the same quiet determination that had kept the land standing long before anyone thought to question its right to exist, knowing that the next phase would demand endurance not just from me, but from a system unaccustomed to resistance that refused to disappear. By the time the third phase of the conflict unfolded, it was no longer possible to pretend the pressure was accidental or uncoordinated, because the escalation followed a rhythm too precise to ignore, one that transformed minor inconveniences into an environment of constant interruption designed to fracture stability from the inside out. The HOA shifted tactics, moving away from vague warnings and into what could only be described as manufactured disorder, a deliberate attempt to create the appearance of chaos where none existed, because chaos justified intervention, and intervention created leverage. Complaints multiplied overnight, each one echoing the last, citing livestock noise at hours when the ranch was silent, alleging unauthorized activity on days when no one but me had been present, and referencing safety concerns that were never substantiated. What stood out was the timing, how reports clustered around moments that mattered, inspections scheduled just before holidays, police visits late in the evening, notices delivered at the end of the week when legal counsel was harder to reach, all of it calibrated to maximize stress while minimizing accountability. The authorities who responded remained professional, but the repetition eroded neutrality, creating a subtle shift where familiarity bred assumption, and assumption opened the door to scrutiny that would never have occurred without prompting. Each visit reinforced a false narrative, not because the officers believed it, but because documentation accumulated regardless of outcome, and that paper trail, however baseless, began to resemble legitimacy to anyone looking from the outside. I could feel the social temperature change, conversations in the surrounding neighborhood adjusting in tone, curiosity hardening into concern, because when enough reports exist, people stop asking whether they're true and start asking why they keep happening. The HOA capitalized on that shift, circulating carefully worded updates that framed their actions as protective rather than punitive, presenting themselves as reluctant enforcers forced into action by my alleged noncompliance. The ranch was recast as a liability, a wildcard in an otherwise orderly system, and that framing mattered more than facts, because perception spreads faster than correction. I watched neighbors who had never set foot on my land form opinions based on summaries and suggestions, their understanding shaped not by experience, but by repetition, and it became clear that isolation was not a side effect of the campaign, it was the objective. Financial pressure intensified alongside social pressure. Fines threatened with increasing specificity, references made to liens and legal action that, while unenforceable, were frightening enough to plant doubt in anyone unfamiliar with property law. The strategy was simple: overwhelm with possibility, exhaust with uncertainty, and wait for fatigue to do the rest. I responded methodically, documenting every claim, cross-referencing dates, compiling footage, and requesting written explanations for every allegation, knowing that transparency was the enemy of manipulation. Each request slowed them down, forced them to justify actions they preferred to execute quietly, and that resistance, though calm, was met with irritation that revealed just how unaccustomed they were to being challenged. Margaret Peterson's influence surfaced more overtly during this phase, her language appearing in notices and summaries with increasing frequency, her priorities reflected in the issues chosen for emphasis, aesthetics elevated above legality, uniformity above precedent. She framed the ranch not as private property, but as a communal concern, blurring lines intentionally to make intervention feel acceptable. Meetings I still did not attend discussed my land in abstract terms, referencing compliance pathways and remediation options that assumed my eventual participation, an assumption that betrayed their endgame. What they hadn't accounted for was the way sustained pressure sharpens awareness rather than dulling it, because instead of retreating inward, I expanded outward, consulting not just attorneys but surveyors, historians, and county officials, assembling a comprehensive record of the ranch's standing that extended beyond my ownership into decades of documented existence. That record told a story no HOA could rewrite, one of established use, grandfathered rights, and legal boundaries immune to reinterpretation by committee. As that evidence grew, so did my resolve, fueled not by anger, but by the clarity that comes when a threat reveals itself fully. The manufactured disorder lost its power once recognized as intentional, because chaos loses its mystique when its source is visible, and I began to treat each disruption not as an obstacle, but as data. The more they pushed, the more they exposed their playbook, and patterns emerged that would have remained hidden had they exercised restraint. I noticed how complaints mirrored language from HOA communications, how concerns shifted in focus depending on which development project was under discussion, how enforcement priorities aligned with land value projections rather than actual impact. This wasn't about quality of life, it was about alignment, about forcing the last irregular shape into a grid that maximized profit and predictability. The ranch's refusal to conform became symbolic, a reminder that not everything could be controlled, and that reminder was intolerable to those invested in the illusion of order. As weeks turned into months, the pressure reached a steady hum, constant but no longer surprising, and in that consistency something unexpected happened. The intimidation lost its edge. Once disruption became routine, fear gave way to analysis, and analysis to strategy, because endurance reframes conflict on different terms. I realized then that the HOA had miscalculated, mistaking persistence for inevitability, assuming that enough force applied over time would break resistance, without considering the resilience that grows when a person understands exactly what they're up against. The ranch had weathered droughts, market crashes, and shifting borders, and it carried that endurance in its soil, a quiet confidence that outlasts trends and committees alike. As another complaint arrived, echoing the last with uncanny similarity, I filed it away without reaction, aware that each attempt to manufacture disorder was inadvertently strengthening the foundation of a case they would one day have to answer for. Chapter closed not with resolution, but with a sense of momentum shifting, subtle but unmistakable, as the tools meant to destabilize began to lose effectiveness, and the campaign designed to force me out started revealing the desperation beneath its polished surface, setting the stage for a confrontation that would no longer be fought quietly in the margins, but openly, with facts, history, and endurance aligned against a system that had underestimated how firmly some legacies refused to be erased. The fourth chapter marked the moment when pressure stopped feeling like harassment and began resembling official doctrine. Because the HOA's actions hardened into procedure, their interference no longer reactive but systematic, codified through motions, votes, and documents that treated my resistance not as a disagreement, but as a flaw in governance that needed correction. What had once been sporadic disruptions evolved into a structured campaign, complete with timelines, compliance windows, and escalating consequences, all framed in the language of policy rather than intimidation. A shift that made everything more dangerous precisely because it appeared legitimate. Notices now referenced internal HOA resolutions, citing newly clarified interpretations of standards that somehow applied retroactively. An absurdity on its face, but one delivered with enough confidence to confuse anyone unfamiliar with the law. The ranch was increasingly described as an anomaly within community planning documents, its independent status minimized, its history reduced to a footnote, while its future was discussed as though it were already decided. I realized then that Margaret Peterson and her board had crossed from enforcement into revisionism, attempting to rewrite the context around my land so thoroughly that its original standing would be forgotten by everyone except me. This phase brought financial intimidation to the forefront, with projections circulated about declining neighborhood value tied directly to my property's nonconformity, a narrative designed to transform personal grievance into collective urgency. Homeowners who had never spoken to me were now encouraged to see my refusal as a threat to their investment, and that framing worked because fear is contagious when profit is involved. The HOA leveraged that fear expertly, presenting themselves as defenders of value rather than aggressors, their campaign reframed as reluctant but necessary action taken in the best interest of the many. What struck me most was how seamlessly they blended speculation with certainty, treating hypothetical impacts as established facts, and repeating those facts until repetition itself became evidence. The police visits, once the most visible sign of harassment, receded slightly during this phase, replaced by administrative pressure that carried deeper implications. Because paperwork doesn't leave when the lights go off, it accumulates quietly, waiting to be used. I found myself navigating a maze of correspondence, deadlines, and threats of legal escalation that existed in a gray space between enforceable and intimidating, a space the HOA exploited with precision. Every response I sent was met with another request, another clarification, another reinterpretation, the goal no longer to resolve anything, but to keep the process alive indefinitely. Time became their weapon, counting on the assumption that even the most determined resistance would eventually falter under the weight of constant engagement. Social isolation intensified as policy replaced personality, because once something is framed as official, people stop questioning it, assuming that legality implies fairness. Invitations stopped coming, casual conversations ended abruptly, and the ranch felt more surrounded than ever, not by physical barriers, but by an invisible consensus manufactured through meeting minutes and newsletters. I became a case study without consent, my situation discussed in abstract terms that stripped away context, reducing years of lawful coexistence to a problem statement waiting for a solution. Yet within that abstraction, cracks began to show, because policy, unlike intimidation, requires consistency, and consistency is difficult to maintain when the foundation is flawed. The more formal the HOA's approach became, the more scrutiny it attracted from places they hadn't anticipated, county offices questioning their jurisdiction, clerks flagging inconsistencies, legal advisors hesitating when asked to put their names on documents that stretched authority beyond its limits. I noticed subtle delays, language softened in places where it had once been aggressive, a sign that resistance was no longer invisible. My documentation, once ignored, began to matter, not because it changed the HOA's behavior, but because it complicated it, forcing them to navigate around facts they couldn't erase. Margaret Peterson's confidence remained outwardly intact, but the messaging shifted, less declarative, more conditional, as though preparing for the possibility that their campaign might eventually be challenged outside their controlled environment. The ranch itself became a symbol in ways I hadn't anticipated, representing not just noncompliance, but precedent, a reminder that not all land fit neatly into modern frameworks of control. That symbolism unsettled them because precedent spreads, and the idea that an HOA's authority had limits was more dangerous than any single violation. I felt the weight of that symbolism acutely, understanding that this fight was no longer just about my grandfather's legacy, but about whether institutions built on assumption could be forced to confront reality. The pressure was relentless, but it had lost its improvisational edge, replaced by bureaucracy that moved slower and left clearer tracks. Each policy change required justification, each escalation a paper trail, and in that transition the HOA had inadvertently given me what harassment never would: visibility. As the chapter drew to a close, with yet another packet of documents arriving thick enough to feel deliberate, I sensed a shift not toward resolution, but toward exposure, because pressure, once formalized, becomes accountable, and accountability has a way of unraveling narratives built on convenience. The ranch stood unchanged beneath the growing weight of policy, its fences still marking boundaries no vote could move. And as I filed away the latest attempt to redefine what had never been theirs to govern, I understood that the campaign against me had reached a point of no return, where retreat was impossible for either side, and the next chapter would be defined not by who could apply more pressure, but by who could withstand the consequences of having turned intimidation into official record. By the fifth chapter, the conflict had settled into a grind so constant that it began to feel like a background condition of life rather than an event. And it was in that endurance phase that the true cost of standing still revealed itself, not in dramatic confrontations, but in the accumulation of small sacrifices that came with refusing to yield. Every day required vigilance, not because I expected something new, but because the same pressures repeated with enough variation to demand attention. Emails arriving at odd hours, certified letters appearing in the mailbox with ritualistic regularity, and notices posted that referenced deadlines designed to create urgency even when nothing legally required action. The ranch remained physically unchanged, but my relationship with time shifted, portions of each day now reserved for review, documentation, and response, a quiet tax paid simply to maintain what had already been mine. The HOA leaned into this attrition, confident that endurance favored them because committees rotate but landowners burn out, and that belief shaped every move they made. They expanded their reach beyond direct enforcement, encouraging adjacent residents to report concerns, framing participation as civic duty rather than surveillance, and in doing so, they multiplied their presence without appearing to act directly. I noticed more vehicles slowing near the property line, more people lingering near access points under the guise of curiosity, and while none of it crossed into overt trespass, the intent was clear: remind me that privacy was conditional now, subject to collective approval. Financial implications grew sharper as well, not just in threatened fines, but in opportunity costs that never appeared on paper, projects delayed because legal clarity mattered, improvements postponed because visibility invited scrutiny, decisions weighed not by feasibility, but by how they might be perceived. Standing still became an act of resistance, because any change, even benign, could be reframed as noncompliance, and that paralysis was precisely the outcome the HOA sought. Margaret Peterson's influence permeated this phase through indirect pressure. Her voice echoed in community discussions that questioned the fairness of exemptions, the sustainability of independent land use, and the need for uniform standards in a modern neighborhood. The narrative shifted subtly from enforcement to philosophy, framing my position not as legally protected, but as ethically questionable, as though longevity somehow conflicted with progress. That shift mattered, because it invited moral judgment where law fell short, and moral judgment is harder to defend against, especially when delivered collectively. I found myself portrayed not as a neighbor, but as an obstacle, a holdover from an outdated model of land stewardship that needed reevaluation, and that portrayal stung not because it was persuasive, but because it revealed how easily history could be dismissed when inconvenient. The isolation deepened, not through hostility, but absence, a quiet withdrawal that left the ranch feeling more like an island than ever, surrounded by people yet functionally alone. And yet within that isolation, clarity sharpened, because the distractions of social approval fell away, leaving only the essential question: what was worth enduring for? The answer remained unchanged, rooted in the understanding that surrender would validate a process designed to erode rights through fatigue rather than law. I leaned into preparation, not as escalation, but as insulation, strengthening my position through knowledge rather than reaction, reviewing zoning statutes, consulting independent experts, and cross-checking every claim against documented authority. Each confirmation reinforced the same truth: the HOA's power ended at my boundary, no matter how often they pretended otherwise. Still, the psychological toll was real, manifesting in a constant low-level tension that made rest feel provisional, because peace could be interrupted at any moment by another envelope, Another visit, another implied consequence. The cost of standing still was measured in energy, focus, and time, resources spent defending rather than building, maintaining rather than expanding. And yet, paradoxically, that cost also became an investment, because every day endured without concession strengthened the precedent that resistance was possible. I began to see the HOA's campaign for what it was, a test of patience disguised as governance, counting on the assumption that no one would choose endurance over convenience. That assumption, like many they had made, underestimated the weight of legacy, the way history anchors resolve in something deeper than immediate comfort. The ranch carried my grandfather's imprint not just in its structures, but in its philosophy, one that valued stewardship over profit and continuity over conformity, and that philosophy guided my response more than any legal strategy ever could. As weeks stretched into months, the pressure plateaued not because it ended, but because escalation risked exposure, and that plateau marked a subtle victory, proof that standing still had forced a recalibration. The HOA could not push indefinitely without consequences of their own, and that realization tempered their actions, introducing caution where there had once been certainty. I sensed it in the tone of correspondence, in the careful phrasing that replaced declarations, in the pauses between attempts that hinted at internal debate. The cost of standing still remained high, but it was no longer one-sided, and that shift mattered more than any single outcome. As the chapter closed, with the ranch quiet under a sky unchanged by human ambition, I understood that endurance had altered the terrain of the conflict, transforming it from a battle of pressure into a contest of consequence, where every move carried weight and every misstep left a mark. The next phase would not be defined by how much disruption I could withstand, but by how much exposure the HOA was willing to risk, and that realization set the stage for a reckoning that would test not just my resolve, but the legitimacy of the authority that had pushed too far, too confidently, for too long. The sixth chapter unfolded quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, marked not by escalation but by hesitation, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of the campaign against me, and that shift revealed itself in the way the HOA's narrative began to slip under its own weight. For the first time since the pressure started, their actions no longer felt confident, but cautious, as though every move required consideration not just of impact, but of exposure. The letters still arrived, but less frequently, their tone softened by qualifiers and conditional language that hadn't existed before, phrases that suggested uncertainty where once there had been certainty. Meetings continued, but their outcomes were summarized more vaguely, decisions framed as ongoing discussions rather than directives, and that ambiguity mattered because it signaled internal disagreement. I could sense the strain of maintaining a story that no longer aligned neatly with reality, because the longer the campaign dragged on, the harder it became to explain why nothing tangible ever resulted from it. No violations were upheld, no enforcement actions finalized, no consequences materialized beyond threats, and that gap between accusation and outcome grew harder to ignore, especially for residents who had been promised resolution. The narrative that painted me as a disruptive force depended on visible disorder, yet the ranch remained unchanged, quiet, and compliant with laws that predated the HOA's authority, and that contradiction eroded credibility in subtle but persistent ways. I noticed questions beginning to surface in community communications, inquiries about jurisdiction, about precedent, about why certain issues remained unresolved despite sustained effort, and those questions, once asked, could not be easily unasked. Margaret Peterson's leadership, once unquestioned, became a focal point of scrutiny, not because she lost conviction, but because conviction alone could not substitute for results. Her messaging grew more defensive, emphasizing process over progress, framing delays as diligence rather than doubt. But the shift was evident to anyone paying attention. Behind the scenes, I continued preparing, not because I expected immediate vindication, but because I understood that when narratives collapse, they often do so suddenly, and being ready mattered. I organized my documentation into a comprehensive timeline, aligning correspondence, complaints, and visits with HOA actions and communications, revealing patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. That timeline told a story very different from the one being circulated, one of targeted pressure tied closely to land valuation milestones and development discussions, a story that reframed the conflict as strategic rather than incidental. The more I refined that record, the more confident I became that the truth, when presented clearly, would speak louder than any accusation. The HOA seemed to sense this as well, their approach shifting from overt pressure to quiet repositioning, an attempt to recalibrate without acknowledging error. They began floating alternative solutions in discussions, vague suggestions of compromise that implied shared responsibility for a conflict I had not initiated, an effort to dilute accountability by spreading it evenly. I recognized this tactic immediately, because compromise offered them an exit that preserved appearance without conceding wrongdoing, and I refused to engage on those terms. The land did not require compromise to exist, and framing its independence as negotiable undermined the very foundation of my position. That refusal further destabilized their narrative, because it removed the possibility of mutual blame, leaving only unilateral action to account for. Meanwhile, the social atmosphere shifted again, not back to normal, but into something more uncertain, neighbors less willing to repeat accusations without evidence, conversations less confident in their conclusions. The isolation that had once felt absolute softened at the edges, replaced by curiosity that edged toward skepticism, and skepticism is dangerous to authority that relies on consensus. I could feel the campaign losing momentum, not because it had failed outright, but because sustaining it now required greater justification than before. Each new action risked drawing attention to inconsistencies that had been easier to overlook when the pressure felt justified. The cost-benefit calculation had changed, and that change slowed everything down. Financial threats all but disappeared during this phase, replaced by rhetorical ones that carried less weight, and even the police visits dwindled, their absence louder than their presence ever had been. The manufactured urgency faded, replaced by procedural inertia, a sign that the machinery driving the campaign had begun to stall. I remained vigilant, aware that retreat could be temporary, but I also allowed myself to acknowledge the shift, understanding that endurance had done what argument alone could not. The ranch, unchanged and unmoved, stood as silent evidence against the claims made about it, and that evidence grew stronger with each passing day of uneventful reality. As the chapter progressed, I realized that the HOA's greatest miscalculation had been assuming control over the narrative itself, believing they could define reality through repetition, without accounting for the way time exposes exaggeration. Their story depended on escalation, on visible disruption, on consequences that never came, and without those elements it began to unravel. The pressure that once felt omnipresent now felt conditional, applied carefully, cautiously, as though the board were testing the ground before each step, uncertain of its footing. Margaret Peterson's presence, once assertive, receded slightly, her communications filtered through committees and advisors, a sign that personal confidence had given way to institutional self-preservation. That retreat did not bring resolution, but it marked a turning point, because it revealed that the conflict was no longer asymmetrical. The HOA could no longer act without considering my response, my documentation, my readiness to challenge their authority openly if pushed. The balance had shifted from pressure to restraint, and restraint, once introduced, is difficult to reverse without consequence. As the chapter closed, with the ranch quiet and the campaign paused in a state of uneasy suspension, I understood that the fight had entered a new phase, one defined not by how loudly the HOA could assert itself, but by how carefully it would have to proceed to avoid exposing the very overreach it had relied on. The narrative had slipped, and in that slip lay the possibility of reckoning, not through confrontation, but through the slow, unavoidable gravity of truth asserting itself over a story stretched too far, for too long, without the substance needed to hold it together. Seventh chapter began not with a single decisive event, but with a series of small fractures that, taken together, signaled the transition from pressure to exposure. Because once the HOA's narrative lost momentum, every action they took carried the risk of revealing more than they intended. The quiet hesitation of the previous phase gave way to internal leakage, subtle but unmistakable, as inconsistencies that had once been contained within board meetings began surfacing beyond their intended audience. I first noticed it in the way information reached me indirectly, forwarded emails missing their original context, summaries that contradicted earlier statements, and references to discussions I was never meant to know about, each one offering a glimpse behind the curtain of a campaign that had relied heavily on controlled messaging. The story being told publicly no longer matched the one unfolding privately, and that disconnect created tension the HOA struggled to manage. Questions from homeowners grew more pointed, not because they suddenly sympathized with me, but because they wanted clarity on why resources were being expended without resolution, why promised outcomes remained elusive, and why the supposed problem continued to exist unchanged. The board responded with reassurances that emphasized diligence and due process, but those reassurances rang hollow in the absence of tangible progress. I recognized this moment as critical, because exposure doesn't require scandal, it requires inconsistency, and inconsistency had become unavoidable. I continued documenting, not just the actions directed at me, but the discrepancies between public statements and private conduct, understanding that the truth rarely needs amplification when it can simply be laid out sequentially. The ranch, by remaining exactly as it always had been, became a control sample against which every claim could be measured, and each measurement undermined the HOA's credibility further. Margaret Peterson's leadership entered a more defensive posture during this phase, her communications framed around unity and trust, language that subtly acknowledged doubt without addressing its source. She emphasized the importance of maintaining confidence in governance, an appeal that suggested awareness of erosion beneath the surface. Behind that messaging, however, the board's actions revealed uncertainty, initiatives postponed, enforcement actions reconsidered, and legal consultations reportedly increasing, all signs that the cost of continued aggression was being reassessed. The exposure phase was defined less by what the HOA did and more by what it stopped doing, because silence, when contrasted with previous intensity, invites interpretation. Neighbors who had once accepted the narrative at face value began comparing notes, noticing that the alleged violations never resulted in visible consequences, that the ranch remained quiet, orderly, and unchanged despite months of warnings. That realization shifted the social dynamic, replacing suspicion with curiosity and curiosity with skepticism, a progression that authority struggles to reverse once it begins. I felt the isolation ease slightly, not because support suddenly appeared, but because hostility receded, replaced by neutrality that allowed space for alternative interpretations to exist. The HOA's attempts to regain control of the narrative grew increasingly abstract, focusing on long-term planning, future considerations, and hypothetical scenarios rather than present facts, an approach that distanced the conversation from the specific claims that had driven the campaign. This abstraction was a double-edged sword, because while it avoided direct confrontation with evidence, it also weakened the sense of urgency that had justified intervention in the first place. Without urgency, the rationale for sustained pressure evaporated, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. I recognized that the exposure phase was not something to accelerate recklessly, because premature confrontation could allow the HOA to reframe or regroup, and so I remained measured, allowing their own inconsistencies to accumulate naturally. The documentation I had assembled now functioned less as a shield and more as a mirror, reflecting the disparity between intention and outcome, between assertion and authority. I began preparing for the possibility that exposure would eventually extend beyond the community, into regulatory or legal arenas where narratives carry less weight than evidence, and that preparation guided my restraint. The HOA's power depended on perception, on the belief that they acted within accepted bounds, and exposure threatened that belief more effectively than any argument I could make. Margaret Peterson's name, once synonymous with order, began to appear in contexts that suggested overreach, her decisions questioned not just by me, but by those she represented, and that shift marked a significant reversal. Authority that must defend itself is no longer unquestioned, and once questioned, it becomes accountable in ways it was not designed to handle gracefully. The exposure phase also revealed alliances within the HOA that had driven the campaign, patterns of support that aligned with development interests and property value projections, connections that reframed enforcement priorities as strategic rather than reactive. Those connections, while not illegal on their own, complicated the narrative of neutral governance, introducing motivations that undermined claims of impartiality. I remained careful not to speculate publicly, allowing facts to speak for themselves, because speculation invites dismissal, while documentation invites examination. As weeks passed, the HOA's actions grew increasingly cautious, each step weighed against potential backlash, each communication vetted for tone and content, a stark contrast to the earlier confidence that had fueled the campaign. The exposure phase was not dramatic, but it was decisive because it shifted the balance of power from assertion to accountability, from pressure to proof. The ranch stood unchanged, its continued existence a quiet indictment of the claims made against it, and that constancy proved more persuasive than any defense I could have mounted verbally. As the chapter drew to a close, with the HOA's campaign visibly constrained by its own contradictions, I understood that exposure was not an end in itself, but a process, one that would continue to unfold as long as the truth remained accessible and the record remained intact. The next phase would test whether the HOA would attempt to reclaim control through escalation or retreat further into abstraction. But either path carried risk now, because once exposure begins, it rarely stops where those in power intend, and the legacy they sought to erase was now shaping the narrative in ways they could no longer fully control. The eighth chapter unfolded with a different kind of weight, one defined not by pressure applied outward, but by consequences folding inward on the very system that had tried to erase me, because overreach, once exposed, does not simply fade, it demands payment in credibility, stability, and control. What became increasingly clear during this phase was that the HOA's prolonged campaign had not only failed to remove me, it had begun to destabilize the structure that enabled it in the first place. Board meetings grew longer and less decisive, agendas bloated with procedural language that avoided addressing the core issue directly, and outcomes framed as ongoing reviews, rather than resolutions, a sign that certainty had been replaced by caution. Homeowners who had once supported aggressive enforcement began questioning the allocation of resources, asking why dues were being consumed by legal consultations and administrative maneuvering that produced no visible improvement. The ranch, still quiet and unchanged, became an unspoken reference point in these discussions, its continued stability undermining every claim that it posed an urgent problem. The HOA's authority, once exercised confidently, now felt defensive, reactive, and fragmented, as different factions within the board debated how far was too far, and whether the campaign had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Margaret Peterson's leadership faced subtle but persistent resistance, not through direct challenges, but through hesitation, motions deferred, decisions tabled, and initiatives slowed by requests for additional review. Her vision of order, once embraced without question, now carried the stigma of risk, because it had drawn attention not just to the ranch, but to the limits of HOA power itself. The cost of overreach manifested in unexpected ways: insurance concerns raised by advisors wary of liability, legal counsel urging restraint rather than action, and county officials quietly monitoring developments that hinted at jurisdictional conflict. These pressures converged to create an environment where bold moves became liabilities, and silence, once a sign of control, now suggested uncertainty. I observed these shifts from a distance, careful not to interfere or provoke, understanding that overreach corrects itself when allowed to run its course. The narrative that had once framed me as an obstacle now struggled to explain why that obstacle remained unmoved despite sustained effort, and the absence of results forced uncomfortable introspection among those who had championed escalation. The HOA attempted to pivot, reframing the conflict as a misunderstanding rather than a campaign, language softened to suggest shared responsibility and mutual miscommunication, an effort to dilute accountability by blurring origins. That pivot, however, could not erase the record, because documentation has a way of anchoring memory when convenience would prefer amnesia. Homeowners began to recognize that the promises of resolution had been based on assumptions rather than authority, and that recognition weakened trust in leadership that had overextended itself. The cost of overreach also appeared socially, as divisions emerged within the community, some residents questioning the ethics of targeting a landowner outside HOA jurisdiction, others concerned about precedent and the potential for similar treatment if they ever fell out of alignment. Fear, once directed outward toward me, began to turn inward, as people imagined what unchecked authority might mean for them. I felt the atmosphere change again, not toward support, but toward caution, a collective pulling back from a conflict that had grown larger than anyone anticipated. The HOA's communications reflected this shift, emphasizing transparency and inclusivity, values that had been conspicuously absent during the height of the campaign, and that sudden emphasis only highlighted the contrast. The ranch, by doing nothing, had forced a reckoning, because overreach thrives on momentum, and momentum had stalled. I continued maintaining my position quietly, responding only when necessary, aware that any overt move could be used to justify renewed aggression. The cost of overreach was not mine to pay, and I refused to assume it by reacting prematurely. As the months passed, the HOA's attempts to regain narrative control grew increasingly constrained by the very policies they had weaponized, procedures requiring justification, votes requiring consensus, and records requiring accuracy. Each layer of formality they had added to legitimize their campaign now limited their ability to maneuver without scrutiny. Margaret Peterson's role shifted further into the background, her influence diluted by committees and advisors tasked with mitigating risk rather than enforcing vision, a stark reversal from her earlier dominance. The campaign that had begun as a confident assertion of control now resembled a liability management exercise, focused on minimizing fallout rather than achieving objectives. I understood then that the cost of overreach was cumulative, paid not in a single dramatic consequence, but in the erosion of authority, the fragmentation of leadership, and the loss of narrative coherence. The HOA had underestimated how visible their actions would become once they failed to produce results, and that visibility had transformed pressure into evidence. The ranch remained the same, its fences still marking boundaries that no vote could move, its legacy intact despite efforts to redefine it, and that constancy served as a silent counterargument to every claim made against it. As this chapter closed, the conflict entered a quieter but more consequential phase, where the question was no longer whether the HOA could force me out, but whether it could survive the implications of having tried. Overreach had its price, and the bill was coming due, not through confrontation, but through the slow realization that power exercised without limits eventually exposes the fragility beneath it, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would determine not just the fate of my land, but the credibility of the authority that had challenged it so confidently and lost control of the narrative in the process. The 9th chapter arrived without ceremony, without announcements or dramatic confrontations, because reckoning rarely announces itself when it comes through systems rather than spectacle, and what unfolded during this phase felt less like victory and more like gravity finally asserting itself after years of imbalance. The HOA did not collapse, nor did it confess, but it began to behave like an institution aware of its own vulnerability, and that awareness reshaped every decision it made. Actions slowed to a crawl, communications filtered through multiple layers of review, and initiatives once driven by confidence now required justification that could withstand scrutiny beyond the community. The campaign against me, never formally acknowledged as such, simply ceased to advance, not because it had been resolved, but because continuing it risked consequences that outweighed any potential gain. The absence of escalation spoke louder than any apology could have, signaling that the board understood the limits it had tested and the exposure it had triggered. Legal consultations, once aimed at enforcement, shifted toward risk mitigation, advising restraint and compliance with jurisdictional boundaries that had always existed but were now impossible to ignore. The HOA's language changed again, adopting neutrality so carefully balanced it bordered on disengagement, a tacit acknowledgement that the narrative they had constructed could no longer be sustained without inviting challenge from outside authorities. Homeowners noticed this shift even if they didn't fully understand its origins, sensing that something had stalled, that a conflict once framed as urgent had lost its urgency without explanation. Questions lingered unanswered, and that silence rather than closure defined the reckoning. Margaret Peterson's presence receded further, her role less visible, her influence diluted by procedural checks that limited unilateral action. And while she remained part of the structure, the authority she once wielded so confidently had been tempered by the realization that overreach carries memory. The ranch, still unchanged, stood as an implicit reminder of that memory, a physical record of resistance that required no narration. I felt the tension ease incrementally, not because trust had been restored, but because the machinery that had generated constant disruption had been forced into neutrality. That neutrality was not peace, but it was stability, a return to a state where life could proceed without the expectation of interruption. I continued documenting, not out of fear, but habit, aware that institutional behavior can reverse when attention fades, and that vigilance, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. The reckoning did not vindicate me publicly, nor did it punish those responsible, but it recalibrated the balance of power in ways that mattered more than symbolic justice. The HOA's authority, once assumed to be expansive, had been narrowed by its own actions, constrained by the realization that not all land could be governed through repetition and pressure. The social atmosphere shifted again, this time toward quiet normalization, neighbors resuming routines without commentary, conversations no longer circling the ranch as a point of concern. The absence of hostility felt unfamiliar at first, like a silence that follows prolonged noise, but over time it settled into something workable. I understood then that this reckoning would not be commemorated or acknowledged, because institutions rarely celebrate the limits of their own power, but its effects would persist in the form of caution, precedent, and institutional memory. The HOA had learned, perhaps reluctantly, that authority exercised without jurisdiction invites consequences beyond immediate objectives, and that lesson, once internalized, changes behavior even when unspoken. I reflected often during this phase on how close the conflict had come to a different outcome, how easily fatigue or concession could have validated a strategy designed to erase legacy through attrition. The cost of resistance had been high, measured in time, energy, and peace of mind, but the cost of surrender would have been higher, paid in precedent that would outlive me. The ranch remained what it had always been, not a symbol of defiance, but a testament to continuity, a reminder that endurance can be a form of power when exercised patiently. As weeks passed without incident, the reality of the reckoning became clearer, not as an event, but as a condition, one in which the HOA operated with greater restraint, aware that its actions were now contextualized by a history it could not erase. The campaign had ended not with triumph or apology, but with limitation, the quiet acceptance that some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence. I felt no need to announce this outcome or to seek validation for it, because the land itself bore witness, unchanged and unyielding. The reckoning had no applause, no moment of recognition, but it reshaped the future nonetheless, ensuring that the legacy my grandfather left behind would not be rewritten by committee or convenience. As the chapter closed, with the ranch settling back into rhythms interrupted but not broken, I understood that the final phase would not be about conflict at all, but about what comes after endurance, how life resumes when pressure recedes, and how a legacy survives not because it is defended loudly, but because it is protected consistently, even when doing so requires standing alone against systems confident enough to forget their own limits. The final chapter did not arrive with relief so much as with perspective, because when the noise faded and the interruptions ceased, what remained was not a sense of victory, but an understanding of what endurance leaves behind when conflict finally exhausts itself. Life on the ranch returned to a quieter rhythm, not identical to the one that existed before the HOA's campaign, but steadier, informed by awareness that peace, once disrupted, must be maintained rather than assumed. The land felt the same underfoot, the fences still marking lines drawn long before anyone thought to challenge them. And yet my relationship with the place had deepened, shaped by the knowledge that legacy is not just inherited, it is defended through patience and consistency. The HOA continued to exist, its authority intact within its proper boundaries, but tempered by caution that had not been present before. A subtle shift that manifested in restraint, in the absence of unsolicited interference, and in a newfound respect for jurisdiction that had once been treated as negotiable. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of excess, but there was distance, and in that distance lay a form of resolution more durable than words. I resumed projects that had been paused, improvements made quietly, thoughtfully, without the anxiety that any change would be misinterpreted, and each completed task felt like a small restoration of agency that had been eroded by years of pressure. The social environment stabilized as well, not through reconciliation, but normalization, neighbors returning to their routines, the ranch no longer a topic of discussion or concern, its presence accepted again as part of the landscape rather than a problem to be solved. I reflected often on how easily the story could have ended differently, how attrition favors systems over individuals unless the individual understands the power of simply remaining. The HOA had relied on the assumption that endurance has limits, that patience eventually gives way to convenience, and in that assumption lay their greatest miscalculation. The ranch's value continued to rise, not as a catalyst for renewed interest, but as a quiet testament to the fact that worth does not grant entitlement, and that ownership, when rooted in history, carries obligations that transcend market cycles. I understood then that the conflict had revealed something essential not just about HOAs, but about power more broadly, how it expands to fill perceived voids, how it tests boundaries to see which will hold, and how it retreats when confronted with resistance that refuses to be provoked into missteps. The documentation I had assembled remained, not as a weapon, but as a record, a reminder that vigilance matters even when calm returns, because systems remember precedent even when individuals move on. I did not dismantle the safeguards I had put in place, nor did I relax my awareness entirely, because peace secured through endurance is maintained through attentiveness. The ranch carried forward not as a symbol of defiance, but as a living space shaped by continuity, its legacy intact not because it was loud, but because it was consistent. I thought often of my grandfather during this time, of the way he approached land stewardship with humility rather than ownership, understanding that what lasts is not what is claimed aggressively, but what is cared for persistently. That philosophy guided the final outcome more than any legal argument ever could, because it framed resistance not as opposition, but as responsibility. The HOA's campaign had attempted to redefine my land through policy and pressure, but in the end, it was the land itself that defined the limits of their authority, its history, its documentation, and its quiet refusal to conform proving more persuasive than any accusation. As life settled into a new normal, I recognized that the story's true conclusion was not the cessation of harassment, but the reaffirmation of something deeper, the idea that legacy survives not because it is defended dramatically, but because it is lived deliberately. The noise had passed, the system had recalibrated, and what endured was not resentment or triumph, but clarity, a clear understanding of where power ends and stewardship begins. The ranch remained, unchanged and unyielding, not as a monument to conflict, but as evidence that patience, when paired with resolve, can outlast even the most confident attempts at erasure. And in that endurance, in that quiet continuation after years of pressure, lay the real inheritance, not the land's market value or its boundaries, but the lesson that some things, when protected with care rather than aggression, simply refuse to be taken, no matter how determined the attempt, leaving behind a legacy measured not in victories, but in what remains standing long after the noise fades away.